my name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And this week on our journey through dystopias, we're looking at the theme of uprisings and the revolutionaries that lead those uprisings. The charismatic men or other creatures who are the faces or other facades of these uprisings against a dystopian society. Exciting stuff. What are the two films that we've got lined up to explore this, James?
Well, yes, as Matt put it, the other creatures we are looking at in today's podcast are apes. We're back on the Planet of the Apes. This week, we're going to be looking at Conquest of the Planet of the Apes from 1973. And we're also going to be taking a look at V for Vendetta from 2005. So these are both two films focusing on uprisings. They're breaking down the walls and getting rid of the dystopia. So yeah, this is the first time that we've really seen this as well, isn't it, Matt? We're properly focusing in on the actual revolutionaries behind these sort of like uprisings.
Yeah, big time spoilers for these two dystopian movies. The dystopias come down at the end of these films. That's the point of these films, is that the revolutionary heroes, anti-heroes, whatever side of the fence you fall on, having watched these films, I think you're supposed to fall on the side of the revolutionaries. They're bringing down the dystopian society by the end of the film. We have seen that, though. We have seen the dystopias falling, but this is really about the leaders of those movements, isn't it?
Yeah, but will it be a happy ending? Because this is the thing that has escaped us in dystopias. And yeah, I'm not sure if we're quite there yet with the happy ever after the apocalyptic totalitarian government takeover. But yeah, we'll see when we properly delve into these two today.
So let's get started then with Conquest of the Planet of the Apes.
The biggest, the newest, the most exciting of all the Planet of the Apes pictures. Climaxed by the spectacular revolt of the apes. The most awesome, the most horrifying spectacle in the annals of science fiction. First pampered as pets, then abused as servants, now oppressed as slaves. Watch the screen explode as man faces ape in the ultimate revolution.
Where there is fire, there is smoke. And in that smoke, from this day forward, my people will plot and plan for the inevitable day of man's downfall. And that day is upon you now!
So this is part 4 in your dearly beloved Planet of the Apes series, James.
Oh, yes.
Do you want to just give us a quick recap of where we are with the apes? Because we looked at Planet of the Apes in our time travel series, of course. But we've been taking a little look, haven't we?
Yes, so if any listeners who haven't heard, we've also been doing a little mini-series on Planet of the Apes over on Patreon. So if you're interested in listening to that, you can fully catch up on all of the ape extravaganzas that have been happening over there. So where we left off in Planet of the Apes, a lot of spoilers ahead for this episode. So let's just stick to the last one. So in Escape from Planet of the Apes, we were back in the present day and some apes had come from the Planet of the Apes from the future and they had landed on Earth. There were lots of things that happened to them and they had a child, didn't they? So at the end of the last film, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, Cornelius and Zira, who were the main characters in that, they had a child, but sadly, both of them were killed off. And there were lots of sort of preludes as to what the future of Earth was going to happen.
Yeah, Cornelius under interrogation, I guess. When he's like being interrogated by the authorities in Escape from the Planet of the Apes, he sets out the history of the Planet of the Apes, which is that a plague wiped out all of the cats and dogs. So humans took in apes as pets and then very quickly learned that they were very fast learners. They could be taught tasks. So they went from pets to slaves, from slaves to revolutionaries to the masters of the human slave population that we see in the first Planet of the Apes films. And this film is just filling in the gaps, I guess, letting that prophecy of Cornelius's play out on the screen and seeing it happen, but it's actually happening with the son of Cornelius and Zira.
Yeah, and I do feel like even if you haven't seen those previous films, you can you get dropped straight into the world in this one, the dystopian world that this place is set in. So we're shown this city where apes are doing sort of menial labor and they're servants. They're basically slaves in this film. And there's lots of, like, the theme of slavery and race is littered throughout this. And it's one of the main topics that it's dealing with. But we'll delve into that later on. But the thing is, this world it's very obviously a dystopia. They've got, like I said, these apes are slaves. They're doing all of these things for the humans, but we're seeing them being treated very badly straight from the offset.
Yeah, they're wearing they look like they're wearing prison jumpsuits, don't they?
Yeah.
And they're being shunted around and knocked around while also being trained to do these sort of simple tasks like sweeping and picking things up, carrying from A to B, pouring glasses of water and stuff like that. So we are shown that they can be trained, but they're trained in quite... It's a brutal way. They're hit and yelled at and, treated like not even second-class citizens, less than that. Just this living mass to be used however the humans want to, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the costumes as well, because they are, like you said, they are in sort of like prison jumpsuits, but they're color-coded as well. So later on in the other Planet of the Apes films, you see this sort of like divide in the class of the apes. So you've got gorillas, you've got chimps, you've got orangutans, and all of the different sort of apes have different sort of stations on the ladder, on the social ladder. And they're all keyed in initially from this film, it seems, as well, because you've got the gorillas in these red suits, and then you've got the chimps in these green suits, and the orangutans in these yellow ones. So they're already being sort of sectioned out into the different sort of species, aren't they? But you see very little of the orangutans in this. It's mainly the chimps and the gorillas. But even so, they're all treated terribly, aren't they?
Yeah, and those jumpsuits they're wearing are kind of the main bits of color you get in this film as well, aren't they? Because the first two films are very they make use of the fantastic like geography that they've got, and there's also some very good sets as well. The underground in the second film, and the insides of the ape buildings in the first and second film. And then the third film kind of made a lot with showing off the American society. So that when the apes were fitting in, they got quite glam, they got all glammed up, and they got to do all of that. And it's like they're all quite visually interesting films. This film is very austere. It kind of slots into that dystopian world through the visuals. There's a lot of like modern or brutalist architecture. The buildings are pretty ugly. What you've got like SS soldiers who are what are they called? They're called like the Ape Patrol or something. Like it's very strange. It's a strange. On one level, it's strange, but if you sort of look at the kind of the social context that Paul Dane was writing under, it makes a lot of sense. But what seems strange is that the cats and dogs died out, and then they took on the apes, and it just became a dystopia. Like those two things don't naturally mesh, do they? Like, we've got apes now. It's very sad that our cats and dogs died, but we've got apes now, and also we've turned into a police state for no reason, seemingly. But obviously, it's for the sort of social parable that Paul Dane's trying to tell. But yeah, you've got these like SS soldiers marching about, smacking the apes about in their pure jet black leathers. So the only real colour that gets splashed into it is through the apes' prison suits, but prison suits are not a nice way to splash colour into your film. It's still quite severe to see a bright orange jumpsuit because you know what it signifies.
Yeah, and because the apes are the ones with the colour, they're the ones which sort of like who get the emotions in this film a bit more, because the humans, you don't see very much of their emotional side. You see sort of like just the surface layer. I mean, the only real character that you see proper emotion for is Armando, who is the ape who becomes Caesar, his sort of like his father figure, isn't he? So he's the sort of like the human you identify with, but that's because he's compassionate towards the apes. But I really want to jump on that point that you made a minute ago, the fact that it is this weird amalgamation of the Planet of the Apes and a dystopia. The police state stuff is so interesting as well, because so Paul Dane came on for Beneath the Planet of the Apes, and he sort of took over writing duties. And when he came on to the franchise, he was bringing with him a lot of sort of like heavyweight subjects he wanted to tackle in this series. And he started off like looking at sort of like nuclear war, and that was a theme in some of the earlier ones, and sort of like so on and so forth. He's really sort of like dug in with the political themes. And with this one, by making it this sort of dystopian society, he's also sort of like looking at, like I mentioned earlier, like race conflicts, because racial justice at the time was like everything, like the world was on fire a little bit, wasn't it? Like literally there were riots going on in the 60s because of like all of these things that were going on. There, like you had the rise of the Black Panthers and Martin Luther King, and then and Malcolm X, but then you had their assassinations as well, and you had all of the Detroit riots that were happening in sort of 1965, all of this stuff which was on TV and in the public mindset. And then you've got Paul Dane watching from Britain, writing about what's happening in America in this film, which is from this really popular franchise, which people are going to go and see because there's been sequels and sequels of this. And he's kind of really getting out all this sort of this thing which no one is really talking about in America, but he's putting it on this big screen in full color, completely different to these black and white TV sets where people have seen these kind of images of like riots and uprisings and all of this kind of stuff. And then suddenly they're seeing it in this film franchise, which started off as this like fantastical science fiction that sort of like you bring your kids to and stuff, but it's quite deep how much it's delving into all of that dystopian stuff. And I think that's what really grabbed me watching it again this time.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Paul Dane a lot over on Patreon. Obviously, you can chalk me up as a Paul Dane fan. I think he's a really, really interesting writer. And I think it's really interesting the way he just plucks out these ideas and throws them into the Planet of the Apes franchise. And what I find most interesting about him is that he had nothing to do with the first Planet of the Apes film. He came in at the second film. But as I'm watching these movies with you for the podcast, I feel like this is Paul Dane's film series. You know, he's the most consistent element. Well, him and Roddy Mcdowell, actually. And again, we talked about Roddy Mcdowell a lot on Patreon as well. Roddy Mcdowell is in the first one, and he wasn't in the second one, I think.
Yeah, he wasn't in the second one, no.
But, you know, I don't think he was as big of a role in the first film as Cornelius is from the third one and into this one. But for those two people to kind of like take over this franchise and really make it their own, Paul Dane is a great writer. He's bringing so much to it. Roddy Mcdowell is amazing. He was so good in the third one, and it's so good to see him back as well, because I didn't know that he would be. So he's playing his own son now. I was delighted to hear his voice and realise that it was Roddy Mcdowell again, because he's a brilliant actor and he's the heart and soul of these sequels. Yeah, it's so interesting that they can usurp a franchise like that and become so integral to it. And to me, they seem like the most important facets of the series. Yeah,
definitely. And like one of the things I found out about recently about Roddy McDowell is that he was a child actor before. So he already had this sort of like this film career. But as he got older, he couldn't shake this sort of like view of him as this child actor, and he's kind of like in this in-between stage. And then when the Planet of the Apes came around, he was able to completely reinvent himself as this character of Cornelius, and sort of through doing that, he was able to, his star rose again. And I mean, he was even doing interviews in full ape makeup and things like that, because people knew him as that character then. So it's so interesting just to see how much he brought to that. And I think he really shows off all of his acting chops in this as well, because you get so much of a transition in his character. He's obviously playing his son from the previous one. He's playing Caesar in this. And yeah, there's a lot to sort of like talk about with his transitions and stuff. But we should also sort of like talk a little bit more about sort of this world that's being set up and apes as slaves, because you've got this opening sequence. You talked about all of the stuff that was happening with the sort of training camps at the start, but I think it really started to get fleshed out when you saw the apes in the different job roles that they have. Like there's a hairdresser, there's a ape who works as like a waiter. They've got all of these sort of like lower labor roles in the world of the film. And it's sort of like, what did you think about that and just how they're introduced first off?
One thing I found very interesting at the start there was that there were labour strikes going on. There were people on strike. The former waiters and porters and cleaners of America who are now finding themselves jobless because apes have taken over. You know, there's something that there's an interesting commentary on the kind of complacentness of a capitalist society to kind of offload jobs wherever possible. You know, automation is a current kind of concern. Is that going to take away jobs from people, or is it going to create new jobs around automation? That's a big debate at the moment. There would be concerns for the people that work in those industries were they to be automated. So in America, in Conquest, Planet of the Apes, in what is it? It's like in the 1990s, I think, is when it's set. They found this resource, basically, that can do all of this work for no money, thus increasing revenue for the cafe owner or whatever, you know, just your down payment on your ape and whatever upkeep. He doesn't need any wages, is infinitely spiraling the profit margin there, but it's putting someone out of work, and it's putting a sentient ape into slavery.
Yeah, and I feel like there's comparisons between this and the first few dystopian films we looked at. I mean, Modern Times, when we looked at that, it was all about industrialization, and you had workers on strike and that kind of thing. And they're all sort of like, they're trying to make something out of their lives, but they're stuck in this sort of loop where they can't make themselves, like, they can't get any more income. And then they're sort of like, they're left destitute. And with this, you've got like a similar thing happening, but because it's so focused on the apes and their struggle, you don't really delve into that. You don't delve into what's happening to the human workforce. But I mean, the way that the ape workforce is treated is pretty horrendous. Like, again, they're being made to do these things that like naturally they wouldn't be doing, like cut people's hair and dish out things as waiters. And yeah, it's such a weird mishmash of seeing those two things together.
And the way that they've got to that point as well, that they were the surrogate for humanity's beloved pets. You know, humanity is grieving at the loss of every cat and dog, so they have taken in apes and seemingly would have treated them the same way and had the same relationship, but have pivoted so easily and quickly to pet owner to slave master when they realize that there's this sort of economic benefit to them to use their apes. Like, if we could train our dogs to, you know, sweep up and serve us drinks at a cafe, would we begin to treat all dogs the way that humanity treats the apes in this film? Would dogs become like slaves? It's hard to imagine, you know, like we love our dogs, we wouldn't treat them that way, but that's what they're suggesting, isn't it? That the greed of this capitalist society is such that you can pivot from pet owner to slave owner on a dime, for a dime.
And that reminds me of that Love, Death and Robots episode where you've got the cats. There's like a robot uprising or something, the cats take over and they get opposable thumbs, and it's kind of like, and then they're the ones in charge afterwards, because they sort of like do a similar thing to this. They take over, like when humanity falls.
I understand now. Humans died out from environmental disaster.
Yeah, pretty much. And also because at one point they genetically engineered their cats to give them opposable thumbs.
Yes, once we could open up our own tuna cans. That was pretty much that for the human race.
Yeah, but in this it's apes. We're not looking at like crazy cats taking over the world. But I mean, even so, I think the struggle that the apes go through is justified, isn't it? And I mean, there is like a need for this uprising, and you see it in like the main character Caesar, who is this revolutionary leader. But there's a lot of lead into that, though, isn't there? Because he doesn't start off as this sort of like this leader of apes. He's like a shy little kid, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a bit more like Cornelius. Cornelius was kind of certainly in the first two films playing second fiddle to Zira. Zira's more outgoing. Cornelius is trying to like reel her in or keep her safe or keep her from getting into trouble and upsetting the order of society. So he's a little bit more like that, but even more so, he's so withdrawn. He just, well, we're introduced to him and he's lived an entire life of secrecy, I guess. Like he can't speak to anyone apart from Armando, or certainly anyone apart from people in Armando's circus.
We should clarify that a bit as well, shouldn't we?
Yeah, sure. So Armando is this surrogate father who Cornelius and Zira, the apes from the previous films, they left Caesar in the care of Armando because Armando was very sympathetic to their plight and their cause, and an animal lover because he owns all. I don't think you're automatically an animal lover if you own a circus in the 1970s, but that's how it's portrayed.
Yeah.
That's the kind of character that Armando is portrayed to be. So he's kind of like becomes a surrogate father, looks after Caesar and raises him and teaches him. But that leads Caesar to be, well, he's very sheltered, but there's this edge to his character, which is like he's quite quick to call out bullshit, isn't he? And to call out, what does he call the humans? Some humans beat some, I can't remember what they're doing, but he calls them like not damn dirty humans. That'd be too blatant of a rip-off, but damn human bastards or something like that.
Yeah, there's one line in there, isn't there?
Lousy human bastards!
He yells that out, even though that's like the most dangerous thing that he could do. But there's something core to his character, which is that if he sees injustice in the human society or in their treatment of the apes, and he's compelled to call it out and call them bastards.
Yeah.
And then Armando has to cover for him.
Yeah, because Caesar, as the only like the ape of two highly intelligent apes from the future, he's got all of this kind of like knowledge, and his upbringing from Armando must have given him this kind of like insight into what humanity is supposed to be like in this idealized way as well. And I mean, Armando would have treated him as an equal, as like a son. So for him to sort of live like that, and then when he's finally exposed to this city where he's seeing his fellow apes being humiliated and treated like shit, then that sort of stirs something in him, doesn't it? Because before then, he's always just like, everything has just been normal for him. Like, he's lived in the circus, everybody sort of treated him as an equal, as sort of like that, seemingly. But then, then finally he realizes that that's not the case. This isn't how it is for everyone. Not all of his kind are like that. Yeah,
you see characters like this quite a lot in cinema. The character that can't quite live in either one of two worlds. You know, he's an outcast from. He can never live a full life as an ape because he can speak. He's too human to be an ape, and he's too ape to live with the humans. And you can see a sort of narrative where he could fit in more with the humans, but the cards are stacked against him from the beginning because of the story that Cornelius told in the previous film, foretelling, the downfall of humanity at the hands of a talking ape. So there's this mythic possibility of a talking ape just sort of floating in the ether that some characters think isn't even real, and some characters are deathly afraid of existing because it will bring about the downfall of all humanity. The cards are stacked against him. He can't live with the humans, and he won't ever be happy with the apes. And that's what leads him down this path of becoming the revolutionary and reshaping the world in his image, I guess.
Yeah, because through the sort of like the narrative of the film, he ends up in one of these sort of like training camps, doesn't he? And he's having to hide his true nature, and he's trying to sort of like get on with the other apes. And it feels a bit like it's the first time that he's been amongst so many apes as well.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, because he's sort of like, he's trying to teach them things as well, isn't he? He's doing all of this kind of stuff to try and enhance their lives a bit, but at the same time he's trying to, like, he can do all of the sort of training stuff very easily, but he's clever enough not to give the game away, so he's constantly trying to sort of like hide the things that he could do.
Yeah, there's some contrivances, like his new owner allows him to pick his own name at random out of a book, and luckily he's able to. Did he pick the book, or luckily the book he's given contains the word Caesar? And
luckily the book has Caesar in it. But he wasn't named Caesar in the previous film, was he? Because Cornelius and Zira named him Milo.
Is he called Caesar at the start of this film? Yeah, Armando calls him Caesar. It's not when he doesn't name himself that when he picks his name out of the book.
Well, it felt a bit confusing, that, because I wasn't 100% sure.
No, I do think Armando calls him Caesar, but it's not explained why his name has changed to Caesar in the interim and he's no longer Milo. Because that was my question at the end of Escape from the Planet of the Apes. Like, it's very obvious where this story's going, and I knew this film was going to be about this event in the Planet of the Apes history, but it wasn't totally clear that Milo the baby would be the ape that stands up against the humans.
And of course, like, a lot of people, like, the more popular version of the Planet of the Apes series now is obviously this sort of like updated reboot. And I mean, in Rise of the Planet of the Apes, the main character is called Caesar, as like a sort of like obviously a direct link to this. So you've got that same sort of like story of the ape who is cleverer than the others, but he's leading this uprising. He's trying to set the rest of his people free.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. We will cover that on Patreon. So if you're enjoying this conversation, head on over to Patreon. In the coming weeks, we will eventually get to Rise of the Planet of the Apes. But it's interesting that Rise of the Planet of the Apes obviously shares a great deal of DNA with this film. It's roughly the same story, and it uses the same character name. But that film does feel more like it's a film about animal rights and animal sentience. It's about animal experimentation, whereas this is a civil rights movie. This is the apes are stand-ins for slaves, real world slaves, and racial tensions in America in the 1970s. Whereas I think they've pivoted away from that slightly in the reboot films. Maybe it's just reflecting changes in society in the interim years between those films, which is fair enough. But for films that are so similar in their plot, there's so much difference in the kind of themes that they're exploring. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, and I think the fact that they've got a black character in this who is kind of like the voice of all of this sort of racial injustice as well, who's seeing this, who has experience as a black man, who is sort of like, he's giving a voice to all of this stuff, these themes that are going on in there, and making the direct comparisons. And that character is Malcolm McDowell, played by Harry Rhodes in the film. What did you think about him, and sort of like the difference in opinion between him and the sort of Third Reich government agents that he's dealing with?
Yeah, he was great. I kind of wanted him to do a bit more. He's really great. Like, earlier you said that Armando was kind of the only human character that's sympathetic, but definitely McDonald is up there as well.
I have to agree.
But it takes a while to kind of like crack that, because he's obviously contending with a lot, and he's kind of wrestling with his own sort of conscience of what they're doing. And it's a great performance from Harry Rhodes as well to kind of put that inner turmoil on screen, but it all kind of comes spilling out at the end, when he has that pleading conversation with Caesar at the very end, at the climax of the film. He's the other kind of emotional anchor of the humans, but these humans are only sympathetic and likable when they are empathizing with the plight of the apes. Humanity in general is shit in these films. It's all gone badly downhill for the soul of humanity, where the only likable characters are the ones who even give half a shit about these apes.
Typical dystopia, isn't it? It's exactly what we've come to love so far on this series. All of that bleakness that's in there. And sort of speaking about bleakness as well, the character of Breck, like, he is kind of like the Hitler, isn't he? He's this sort of like you said earlier, sort of like it seems like every dystopian film we've looked at so far, there's some sort of like, I mean, the Nazis are the ultimate fear of dystopia coming. That's sort of like, and that's where all these comparisons come from, because they're making sure people are still aware of it as well. And it's obviously the biggest sort of totalitarian government that could have come into play. And I mean, Breck, apparently Don Murray, who played Breck, he would rehearse, so he knew German, and he would rehearse his lines in German to try and get the sort of like the tone of sort of like a Nazi general. And he said like he would do them in German first, and then he would do them in like English afterwards. So he was doing all of this to try and really sort of build this character up. And when he said that, I was like, wow, this is quite a lot, but it's also, it's questionable at the same time. The fact that he thinks like, I'm just going to speak German and then I'm going to be like, give this Nazi persona. But you can see where he's coming from.
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable acting decision given the way they've costumed the Ape Patrol. I keep calling them
the Ape Patrol. I think that's what we should call them, the Ape Patrol.
The way that they've been costumed, they're definitely supposed to look like SS officers. So I think it works to have the governor at the head of it be learning his lines in German. That's an interesting way of doing it. What makes him such an interesting character, though, is that he's right. He's absolutely right. Like, he's concerned that if there is a talking ape, that talking ape will start a revolution that will set a chain of events that will bring about the downfall of humanity. And he has that speech that when Caesar's leading the charge to take over the communications tower, he's in there going like, they cannot breach that wall. If they breach that wall, then humanity will fall. It spells doom for humanity. And you're watching it and he's like, he's right, but I still want it to happen.
Yeah.
I'm on their side, but he's absolutely right. Like, you actually can't. It's kind of hard to fault him in a way. He's a figurehead for the awful treatment of the apes, so that's what you can fault him for. But his actions in the film to kind of stop Caesar, basically, in the second half of the film, you can't really hold that against him. He's a military leader protecting his side. It just, he's on the wrong side of history.
And I mean, the thing is, like, fascists, given all of their sort of like beliefs and things like that, they're still human beings. So they've still come to these decisions through their own thought process. So the way you're describing him then, like, he's thought all this, so that's what's driven him to do it. But on the other side of things, he's done some horrendous things to the apes beforehand, and he's completely sort of like treated them like they're not even alive, like they're not even like worth caring for. They're living creatures, but he just doesn't give a shit. And you see him sort of like, just the way he reacts to them. And it's out of fear as well, I guess, because he is afraid of this talking ape and this uprising, which has been sort of like talked about in the previous film as something which could happen. So yeah, I think it's interesting coming at it from that perspective, the fact that he is all of these things, but he is also like a person, and he's come to those conclusions through all of these things that are going on.
But he has to be held accountable for coming to those conclusions.
He gets held accountable, doesn't he?
Well, that's an interesting phrase, because I don't think he does get held accountable as much as I would have liked to have seen him get held accountable. Should we talk about the ending of this film?
Well, yeah, the ending is a weird one, because what did you think when you watched the cut that you saw?
Let's explain what happened behind the scenes. There's two endings to this film. The theatrical cut, there's the main ending, and then there's the original cut that's been restored on the Blu-ray releases. I didn't know that when I was watching the theatrical cut, but I knew that something wasn't right, because just the way it's put together and the way it sounds, it all sounds wrong. Roddy McDowell is giving the greatest speech of his career, I assume. I haven't seen any of his films apart from Apes films, but he's giving this incredible, impassioned, angry speech telling McDonald, who is pleadingly trying to talk him down from violence, just telling him, no way, like, it's over for you. I'm taking these apes all over the world, and we are done with you humans. We're taking you down. And then he very clearly commands the gorillas to smash Breck's head in with the butts of their rifles. They raise their rifles, and then he launches into another speech that sounds completely different. Like, it sounds like it was recorded in a completely different room, but the character's still in the same location, and footage is played backwards, like very obviously played backwards, where they then lower the butts of their rifles, and it's the same clip but going backwards, and then it all just feels incredibly strange. And I knew that I was watching a different ending. This wasn't, and even if you take away all those technical things where, like, I can hear the ADR and I can see the footage playback, even if you take all of that away, this is tonally a very well-made film, and I was exactly in the place that the audience is supposed to be at the end of the film, which is kind of expecting an orgy of violence, not necessarily for that to be morally right, and it should have made me feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it's what I kind of needed to happen. I was worked up into a frenzy that needed that kind of climactic act of violence and then I would need to meditate on what I thought about that violence, but that's what felt like needed to happen. And it's very clear that that's what J. Lee Thompson did, and I think J. Lee Thompson is a good enough director to inspire that feeling in me. And it was so disappointing to then suddenly realize, like, something's been pulled out from under me here, and it doesn't happen, and then it has a sort of happy moralistic ending.
Yeah, I mean, there's all this lead up to it as well, isn't there? You've got all of the apes grabbing weapons and Caesar sort of overseeing things and getting them to do like little things to aid the revolution. Like, you see Caesar around the city just giving apes this little look like, oh, you better do this now and you better do that. And then it leads up to them all storming the sort of like the citadel, whatever it is, with their guns drawn and their knives out, and they're all ready to go. But this ending that they had in mind is not what audiences wanted, apparently, in the early screenings. They thought it was too violent, and they, like, obviously it gets quite violent towards the end. I reckon it could have been more violent given like what they're dealing with. They're dealing with a massive uprising, and you do see some quite horrendous scenes in it, but like there's people on fire and stuff like that. But it's like, you need that in the sort of like, you need to show what the cost of this violence and this sort of like mistreatment is.
And for Caesar to become the very thing that he hates is important for the trajectory of the apes as a species. Because we've seen the first film, we've seen that they do become slave masters, cruel slave masters, and you've seen it in Roddy McDowell's performance, going from the meek, sheltered, shut away at the start of the film to this very angry war chief at the end of the film. Like, it's not a happy trajectory for him. It's actually it's very sad that he becomes such a violent, hateful person at the end of the film. But that's the point. That's what this society has led him to. That's the natural conclusion when you're faced with a society that is treating your people like this. That doesn't make you a great person. It makes you angry and vengeful. And this violence only begets more violence. And that's how we get to the first Planet of the Apes film. It's so disappointing that we don't get to see that. And I'm so annoyed at those test audiences who don't know what's good for them, like. And
I think this film would have been like, I think it would be considered a better film by a lot more people if they'd seen that original edit. And like, having seen that original finale, it's really powerful, and it sort of ends at the right moment. It ends with Breck being beaten by the gorillas, and it's sort of like, it's all those things you were saying. It's sort of like, it's the fact that the message is, if you keep this violence going, it's just going to be a circular thing, and there's going to be more violence and more revenge, and it's just going to keep going round and round and round. And showing that on screen really sort of like it moves something in you, even if you don't fully realize it. You sort of like, you need that bleakness to it.
Yeah, absolutely. They're bleak films. Like the third one's a little bit more cheery, but the first and second films they're very bleak films, famously bleak films. You know, it needs that bleakness, and it should have that bleakness. And it's a shame it ends on this sort of idealized moralistic point. And even in that original cut, you still have a witness to that savagery. I think she's called Lisa. There's the female ape that's kind of been Caesar's partner in the second half of the film. She's horrified. She's watching this violence and she's horrified. So you've still got that witness within the film who sees the violence for what it is and is disgusted by it, regardless of who's doing it to whom. Like, she's still there to kind of give you the moral anchor of it. And she's the one who, I guess in the theatrical cut, she kind of talks Caesar out of it, right? Because she's the second ape to speak, and she says no. And supposedly, it was unclear if Caesar was always going to back down, or if it's her pleading with him that changes his mind. I'm not sure, but he does change his mind, and stands the whole thing down and just declares the planet of the apes.
And there's something which I've sort of mentioned in the Patreon episodes, which I will now sort of reveal to you now. Do you know who plays the ape Lisa?
No.
It's Natalie Trundy, who we've seen in the previous films, and I told you'd see her again in this one.
Oh.
And here she is, hiding in ape costume this time. So, yeah, that was quite a nice touch, seeing her there. And, of course, Natalie Trundy, who was married to Arthur P. Jacobs at the time.
Oh, everyone's married to each other in these films. Who was she in the previous films?
So she was one of the mutants in Beneath the Planet of the Apes.
Oh, yeah.
And she was Dr. Stephanie Branton or something like that in Escape from Planet of the Apes. So yeah, she's made her appearance in lots of them. So yeah, it's good to see her hidden in there somewhere.
The Jeffrey Combs of the Apes franchise.
What you have seen here today, apes on the 5 continents will be imitating tomorrow.
With knives against guns, with kerosene cans against flamethrowers.
Where there is fire, there is smoke. And in that smoke, from this day forward, my people will crouch and conspire and plot and plan for the inevitable day of man's downfall, the day when he finally and self-destructively turns his weapons against his own kind, the day of the writing in the sky, when your cities lie buried under radioactive rubble, when the sea is a dead sea and the land is a wasteland, out of which I will lead my people from their captivity, and we shall build our own cities in which there will be no place for humans except to serve our ends. And we shall found our own armies, our own religion, our own dynasty, and that day is upon you now!
So yeah, we prefer the bleak ending then, I'm guessing.
Yeah, definitely. I need to track down a copy of the better version and then replace that in my library as my main version.
Yes, replace those memories.
Yeah. But yeah, this was another great addition to the Planet of the Apes series. I'm very much looking forward to continuing with Battle for the Planet of the Apes over on Patreon. So yeah, once again, do come and join us on Patreon if you want to hear that.
Yeah, and I think they're also different. It's interesting looking at this series and finding this one, which is so dystopian and so sort of like it's depicting the real world, but also you've got apes as the sort of substitutes for humans and the general public in this. But in the next film, it's showing a dystopian society. It's one very close to our hearts. It, of course, is Britain again. We're seeing a dystopian Britain once again on the podcast as we look at V for Vendetta from 2005.
Just before we get into V for Vendetta, James, I think we should just take a quick moment. And I'm leading it this time, actually, James, so just hold on.
Oh, the revolutionary leader that is Matt.
I just want to take a moment to talk about our Patreon. We've mentioned it before. We're doing our Planet of the Apes mini-series. That's been loads of fun. I'm really enjoying that. But I just wanted to give a little extra plug for the other things we're doing on Patreon, like our wonderful episode on Santa Claus Conquers the Martians from Christmas time. Wasn't that so Christmassy, James?
So Christmassy. And yet another conquest. But the amount of conquesting that happens in that film, I mean, if you want to find out, you have to go and listen to the Patreon episode. Also, speaking of other content, as we are looking at a film written by the Wachowskis, we also have plenty of extra Matrix content over on Patreon. We've got the Animatrix over there. We've got the new Matrix film. We've got a review of that. So yeah, feel free to check those ones out.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad you agree with me. I just wanted to get that out there. I just wanted to quickly interrupt the show and just talk about our Patreon because, you know, you've been banging on about it all these weeks, James, and I just wanted to say a little piece about our Patreon. So head on over there. It's patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi.
The truth is, there is something terribly wrong with this country.
Whoa! Excuse me, miss.
I'm sorry.
Not yet, you're not, but you will be. The only verdict is vengeance. A vendetta. If our own government was responsible for the deaths of 100,000 people, would you really want to know?
You're getting back at them for what they did to you.
Fear became the ultimate tool of this government.
I want everyone to remember why they need us.
I wish I wasn't afraid all the time.
People should not be afraid of their governments. The government should be afraid of their people. This is exactly what he wants. Chaos.
Why is Britain always a dystopia?
Yeah, well, because England prevails.
But yeah, of course, we are back on home soil for this one. And yeah, it's all about like British history as well in this, isn't it?
Yeah, it is really about that. And I want to talk about that because the way we're taught about Guy Fawkes in school, I don't know what it was like for you, but like he's a villain. Like he's literally culturally a villain. And, you know, like with good reason, like he was a terrorist. He was trying to blow up the Houses of Parliament, but we don't get a lot of the ideology of Guy Fawkes in the British public school system. I guess some would argue fair enough. I guess kids, 10-year-old minds are not like best equipped to sort of try and wrap their head around getting into the mind of the man who wanted to blow up the Houses of Parliament. But that's what V in this film has done, and fully supports the actions of Guy Fawkes.
Yeah, it's very interesting the way they sort of positioned this story as well, because in the original sort of the graphic novel by Alan Moore, you've got this story which is sort of a response to Thatcherism in the early 1980s and sort of like this conflict between a potential fascist state and anarchism and all this kind of stuff that was happening in the 80s. Whereas this one, being released in sort of like in the 2000s, in 2005, you've got the Wachowskis taking over sort of like writing duties on here, and they're making a screenplay which is quite sort of like honed into what's going on in America as well, with like the US political context of everything, sort of this idea of terrorism and then how we view terrorism, and all of those kind of themes are in this. And I think you're right, that it's how we view V, because V is our protagonist in this, and we view him as this charismatic leader and this sort of like symbol, whereas I think in the graphic novel they kind of concentrated on the fact that he's really violent, and he's also like a bit unhinged, so sort of like the anarchy aspects come through a lot more in that. So whereas this is sort of like, from what I gather, it's toned down a lot of the sort of the hard edges that Alan Moore was putting forward in that version. But I mean, still, you're looking at sort of like these uprisings again and a revolutionary, but you want to be on their side, especially in the sort of like in this dystopian society that we're being shown.
Yeah, and so what what are we shown of that dystopian society? Because what's quite interesting about this is that that we're hinted. There's hints of like a quarantine zone. There's like some sort of biological problem outside of London or in various places in Britain. But what we see on screen doesn't look that different from 2005 Britain, does it? Or 2005 American soundstage, as may be the case. But it looks fairly contemporary, and it's not too different, but we're kind of shown that through again fascistic police state forces that are oppressing people. We've got arbitrary curfews that can lead to you getting raped and murdered if you're a few minutes late on the streets. That's how we actually see this dangerous world. But on the face of it looks very familiar, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite sad that it's quite prevalent now as well. When you look at this film and what it's about a deadly pandemic that hit Great Britain in certain parts, caused lots of deaths. There are then enforced, like you say, curfews, like which you could call lockdowns, and all of this stuff's happening in the wake of this totalitarian government, which are in control. Obviously, all of this is fictionalized, and any comparisons to what may or may not be happening in the world now is totally by coincidence.
Yeah, all of that pandemic stuff, though. Again, kind of happens on the edges of this film. I don't know if that's. I don't even know if how much of that is taken from the book and how well explained it is. But it is. You have to do quite a lot of work to actually understand what's going on in the background of this film. I don't want to go in too hard on this film because it's not without its charm. It's certainly got some things going for it. But I'm not a great fan of this film. And I was quite surprised by how hard it was to actually understand what was going on in the world of the movie. That pandemic is not very well explained in the movie version of this, I didn't think.
And in the graphic novel, it's more to do with the fact that there was a world war and there was a nuclear war. So places like Africa are gone. They've been wiped out. So it's more sort of like that stuff's been going on in the wider world. Whereas this, it's kind of like all of the sort of like the pandemic stuff in inverted commas is they're sort of like it's viral terrorism though, isn't it? That's how they're looking at it. And we later on find out that this terrorism may or may not have been down to the government and and so on and so forth. But going back to sort of like what this dystopian Britain looks like, it's got all of this stuff going on underneath, but on the surface, it seems like everyday Britain. It was like what it was like in 2005. Like people are going about their normal lives. They're watching TV, but
they're watching tiny flat screen TVs.
Yes, tiny flat screen TVs. Who would do it? But yeah, all of this stuff's going on, but there's all of these restrictions and it's a bit 1984, isn't it? I mean, to say the least.
It's heavily 1984, and good on them. They managed to get John Hurt to play the big face on the TV screen. He's fantastic in this. He's obviously having a tremendously good time, mostly just sitting in a room talking into a camera until later in the film. He's very good in this, and he kind of, I don't know, this film, this film's got like better actors than it deserves, and they're not all doing a great job, but John Hurt is doing a fantastic job in it.
Good old John Hurt. And of course John Hurt is playing Adam Sutler, who is the big dictator, whose name sounds very close to Adolf Hitler.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I hadn't clocked that, but yeah, that's a nice little play on names there. And he's sort of Big Brother-y in that he's a big face on a screen.
I mean, that is it.
But he's a real figure, isn't he? He's a real person, and he really is in charge in so much as anyone can be in charge in a dystopia where someone's just lurking around the corner to usurp you and throw you out and take your job. But he is really there behind the scenes ordering people around.
Yeah, he's the head honcho, but is he just a figurehead where it's like we don't delve too much into that in the film? But I was still sort of like, I was really fascinated by all of the things that were banned in the society. So you've got like religion, sexuality, sort of like any sort of form of individualism is frowned upon. You can't have it. Like Stephen Fry's character, who is great in this, he's sort of like he's the sort of like driving force behind that as well. I felt
it's an extremely puritanical Christian version of a dystopia. I guess it's got quite a lot in common with The Handmaid's Tale, but without the reproductive problems that are being distorted and warped in that series. But yeah, it's very highly Christian. I think they do mention Jews and Muslims. Again, it's one of those things that's not actually that well explained. I don't know if they're trying to like shy away from it in the film, but like I think that Jews and Muslims have been like rounded up and they either killed or deported from this Britain. They are no longer around. You are not allowed to be gay. You need to keep that to yourself if you are. And again, like, will you be killed? It just isn't explained. Like, what happens to the people that dissent and aren't?
Well, it looked like they were taken to concentration camps, because you've got the whole story of Valerie, which you find out later on in the sort of like the prison scene, and sort of like her whole story about how she ended up getting imprisoned. I think that's kind of like representative of all of these people which are from different religions and have different sexualities and all of this kind of stuff. They're all sort of like, they're all being taken out by Adam Sutler's regime because they're different.
Yeah.
And that's why Dietrich has this, like, he has a Quran, he has like gay pornography, and he has all of these things which have been outlawed in this secret room.
Yeah. The thing with Valerie that I've never been sure about with this film is that do we take it at face value when V says no, she was a real woman? Because I mean, V is like pretty detached from reality, and Valerie is introduced during a sequence that is this insane falsified account of events that V has put together to warp Evie's mind to be as deranged as he is. That's how Valerie comes into it. So this whole thing, I guess, yeah.
It depends how much you trust him,
you're
isn't
right.
it?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, he's. I thought that he was being portrayed as an unreliable narrator. I thought that was sort of what they were going for. But then we have to take him at face value when he tells us about the concentration camps. And everything that happens in V's past is actually quite important to fleshing out some of the backstory of this dystopian Britain and how he came to be and why he is. But he's, I don't know, I see him as a little bit like the Joker in The Dark Knight. Like, I don't actually put a great deal of stock into everything he tells us about his past, but maybe I've been misreading him and misreading the film in doing that.
I think you're right, though, because he is sort of like, he's this sort of like this mad person who speaks in this very sort of like flowery manner and is obsessed.
Irritating manner.
Poor old Hugo Weaving. And his sort of like everything about him is very sort of like a caricature, isn't it? Like, even the Guy Fawkes mask, everything is sort of like hidden away. You don't know too much about him, but yet you are supposed to see him as this heroic protagonist at the same time. So I think there's a bit of a mismatch there. But I think you're totally right. He is this sort of like, I would view him as kind of like an unreliable narrator, but that's because you don't know his end goal and you don't know his plans, and all of that is sort of hidden until the end. Even so, a lot of it is just driven by vengeance as well, it seems, because he's got this hit list of people from the government he wants to kill.
Yeah, and they do confess to their sort of evil deeds. So we've got a little anchor of relatively objective truth about what was going on. And we've got this detective character as well, who's kind of learning about V's history and what these government officials were doing back in the day. So yeah, there is more to it. I think I'm being unfair on the film. I just find it a really annoying film. I find V so annoying. I feel so bad for Hugo Weaving. He's such a fantastic actor, but I think there's just nothing you can do with this role. You've got to wear a mask. Like he's basically like doing mime to express himself, and it's incredibly visually unpleasant. I thought I can't watch him in this role.
And he had to redub a lot of the lines, obviously, because he's talking with a mask, so it's all muffled. So they had lots of issues with that.
And he wasn't saying a lot of these lines because James Purefoy was originally cast, and James Purefoy pulled out a couple of weeks into shooting. I'm sure that, I don't believe that, I'm sure that Hugo Weaving did this in part as a favour to the Wachowskis because James Purefoy pulled out. He's so badly cast. He's 20 years older than Natalie Portman, and he's they sort of have this awkward torture love story, which is weird enough because of the torture, but he's also 20 years older than her. I didn't buy any of that.
Yeah, it's got its flaws, definitely. And I mean, all of that sort of that's in there, but I still think it's got some interesting things that it's dealing with still in terms of sort of being worthy of being on the series as well. And I think it's important to talk about because it's even things like the portrayal of the media that it's in here. It's not just one form of the media you're seeing. Obviously, you're seeing this this news program, which is sort of it's basically like a UKIP news program on every day from this sort of this quite sort of this fascist sympathizer who is constantly just sort of regurgitating news that he's been fed by sort of Sutler and his goons from the sounds of it.
Yeah, Lewis Prothero, I think my favourite character in the film. Him and the Chief Inspector Finch, they're by far the best things about this film. And actually what I dislike about the film is that it's not centred around the characters that I like more.
Fair enough.
I think Hugo Weaving and Natalie Portman are awful in this, but you've got really interesting characters like Stephen Rea as the Chief Inspector Finch, who's unravelling this mystery and kind of having his perception of reality really fall apart as he learns the truth. And you've got this fantastic performance from Roger Allam as Lewis Prothero, just really chewing the scenery, just really incredibly narcissistic. That scene where he's watching his own his own performance, his own broadcast in the shower, repeating his own lines back to himself. England prevails. He's great. And you're right. The inner workings of the TV studio and their connections to the government. I can't remember the names of the departments. They've tried to do a mini true, mini love thing with the nose, the ears, the eyes, and whatever. But I can't remember them. But the links between the media and the government agents and how they're all kind of in the pocket of each other. That's all fantastically done, and the control of the media over the society as well, the knock-on effect of that on society. I really enjoyed all of that stuff.
Yeah, and then the fact that Dietrich is just juxtaposes all of that stuff you see with the sort of the politics being shown by doing a talk show which has a fake version of Adam Sutler on. And I was watching some video and they kept talking about how it's like a deep fake almost, before deep fakes were around, having two Adam Sutlers in the sort of in the show and then making this sort of farce out of it. I found that really good. It was nice seeing sort of a different side of the media, because the media is sort of fighting back at that point, and you never see that in these dystopian films because they're always completely controlled by the totalitarian government. So when you've got sort of again a revolutionary almost taking control and trying to get their point across in the biggest medium that is available, which is television, that I found that sort of I thought that was an interesting touch to have in there. Yeah,
it's very useful from a plot point of view because there's lots of scenes where you see just normal people, the people that V wants to inspire and to meet him at the Houses of Parliament on the 5th of November. There's lots of shots of them reacting to the news and stuff. So it's very useful to have that scene of Stephen Fry's piss take episode, and you can see their reaction to it and they're loving it, and it's part of the momentum. And it's also very nicely done that you can then just have that horribly violent scene where they burst into Stephen Fry's house and beat the shit out of him, put a sack over his head and drag him away. That's all great. But do you know what's weird? Like, Stephen Fry's in the end of the film, he survives and he's fine. Like, he's in the crowd that storms Parliament.
Yeah, but it's like a vision of like all of the people that were part of the uprising, because you also see the little girl who was killed.
Yeah, who died, yeah.
So you see all of these faces which have led up to that moment where they've got sort of like the fireworks at the Houses of Parliament and everything's being like exploded.
I hate that. I think that's stupid. They're all there. They're all there.
Because you think Guy Fawkes is a villain, Matt. That's why.
That's what I was told at school, James.
Brainwashed. We've all been brainwashed.
I burn an effigy to him every year. You think I'm going to get behind this man? No, I don't mean the Houses of Parliament. I just mean, the girl and Stephen Fry showing up in the masks at the end. I think
too
that's
much.
Lame. It also, I think I should explain. I should explain some of this. That like 2005. So I was 17. So at just the absolute worst age a person can be, a 17-year-old boy. I went to the cinema with all my shitty 17-year-old friends, and I do think this is a silly film, and I stand by that. But we spent the whole film taking the piss out of it, and I just remember like the film. I feel so sorry for teachers of teenage boys, but like, if you lose them, you lose them. And when V comes on scene and he says that ridiculous speech where every word contains the letter V, we just burst out laughing. It's like, who's going to take this guy seriously? He's not inspiring me, a 17-year-old boy, to get behind him and overthrow the government. He's not going to fucking inspire the public of Britain in this film. And I was just like, we were done. Like, I couldn't take anything seriously.
Voila! In view, a humble vaudevillian veteran, cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate. This visage, no mere veneer of vanity, is a vestige of the vox populi, now vacant, vanished. However, this valorous visitation of a bygone vexation stands vivified, and has vowed to vanquish these venal and virulent vermin, vanguarding vice and vouchsafing the violently vicious and voracious violation of volition.
And the other point that I remember laughing out loud is right at the end of that film, before you see Stephen Fry and the little girl, Natalie Portman turns to the detective and goes, "He was my father." And again, I just burst out laughing because I was like, what? That's not... that hasn't been explained. And then she goes, "And my mother, and my brother, and your brother." And like, I was like, oh, okay, right, yeah, I get it. Yeah. Stupid.
Yeah, because they've got the Count of Monte Cristo stuff in there as well, haven't they? And all that kind of flowery stuff to try and make this film, which is basically, it's kind of got a tinge of Equilibrium to it. And obviously we talked about Equilibrium as being sort of like a Matrix ripoff to an extent.
Yeah.
And like the gun fu and all of those ridiculous things, which as a 17-year-old boy you would love, but you go back to it and you want the dystopian stuff. Whereas this, it's kind of got a bit of that action stuff, but not quite enough to... It's kind of on the other side of the spectrum, isn't it? Because it's dealing with all these weighty themes, but it's got this ridiculousness to it as well. I mean, like the fights that V gets into are like, they're entertaining. Like when he's slicing off that guy's wallet with the police badge or whatever it is, and like he does all these crazy things with the knives and all this kind of stuff that's going on. But there's only sort of like little bits of that, like, but the rest of the film is trying to meander its way around explaining the reasons for this dystopian society and trying to sort of like get people to understand why there's this revolution on the horizon.
Yeah, that's so important to like his mission, isn't it? Like convincing the public to join him. But he doesn't like go in too hard. That again, it comes back to like the sort of depiction of the media being one of the stronger parts of the film. Like he commandeers that broadcast studio so he can put his case to the public, but he just doesn't do a lot of that. He's got a whole year to kind of convince people of his point, but I guess the argument would be that it's he shouldn't have to, because everyone in Britain agrees with him already. They're just too scared to do anything about it. And that one speech is enough to kind of rally them up. And that is what happens. That's how it's depicted. But I could have gone for a bit more proactive, I don't know, lecturing, I guess, making your case to the public.
Yeah, but then again, it's because it's like it's tiptoeing between being like a revenge film as well, because you've got V chasing after these politicians for the majority of the film.
Do you think that his personal revenge undermines his political ideology?
I think to an extent, yeah, because it's kind of like, it's a weird thing to get your head around again, isn't it? Because the reason he's doing it is because he's getting rid of the head people in charge of this government. And then he thinks by doing that will help with installing a new government potentially. But there's no sort of like, he hasn't thought that far ahead.
Yeah, and specifically, he's getting rid of the people who are now the heads of government, but were formerly running this detention facility where he was tortured and turned into the weird superhero he is now.
Yeah, and that's a whole other thing as well, isn't it? Just the yeah.
Like his ideology is very murky, I think, because he is primarily motivated by revenge. He's right. He should overthrow this government. It's awful. It's oppressive. It's committing acts of terrorism on its own population for the sake of control. But he's. I think that there's some redemption there in that he kind of like he kind of hands the keys over to Evie and says the decision's actually yours. That's his kind of redemption and saying like, you know, I'm actually just going to go and kill this guy. It's up to you whether or not you're going to overthrow the government. But I've set everything in motion so you can do it if you want to.
Yeah. And I think he's much more effective as this kind of like this symbol of sort of like freedom and justice and all this kind of stuff. But it's when you're looking at the character that you're actually seeing, it's a guy who wants to get revenge for the way that he was treated and the way that other people have been treated. So he's got the film is called V for Vendetta. He's got a vendetta against these people. Sure. So yeah, it's kind of like it's a tricky one, isn't it? It's a very tricky one.
I think it's another good example of like I do need to read this book. I haven't read that many Alan Moore things, but I do like Alan Moore. But I was so disappointed with the film when I first saw it that I've never been able to will myself to pick up a copy of the book. But I would imagine that all of that stuff is done a lot better under Alan Moore's pen than the Wachowskis. And all love and respect to the Wachowskis, who, you know, we've talked about the Matrix films and how I've recanted on my hatred of the Matrix sequels. I like them now, but you know, I think they haven't done a great job of translating this story to the screen.
Yeah, and I think it was always going to be a difficult task making sort of like the length of that graphic novel to this 2-hour film and being able to translate all of that stuff in there and still have to sort of make it a mainstream film. There's a lot against it. But I mean, I still enjoyed it. Like, even though it's like, it's quite hard to figure out what's going on half the time with all of this sort of like intense backstory that's going on, I think I still had fun with it. There were moments when I was like, okay, this isn't as bad as I remember it. And I remembered it being not very good.
We haven't even really talked about Evie that much, the other kind of protagonist of the film. I mentioned like the prison scenes and how mad they are. That's a really mad sequence in a film. Like, I understand what they're going for. It's very Guantanamo Bay.
It's 1984, isn't it? It's the Room 101. It's all of this kind of stuff. But they flipped it so that
they have flipped it.
It was
really
V all the time.
Yeah. I just don't understand how you can come back from that with your characters and be like, yeah, thanks for torturing me, V. I love you.
It's like, no, she doesn't have fear now, Matt. She's like, she's empowered as a woman.
Have fear. If
she can do whatever she wants.
She's empowered as a woman. What a way to empowerment.
Oh my God, that's so like, yeah, that's dark, isn't it?
It's extremely grim. It's just such an unforgivable thing to have your protagonist due to his love interest, his ostensible love interest.
Yeah.
And also, like, before that, he'd pimped her out to a paedophile. This is what I mean about his ideology is murky.
He's mental.
Best.
He's absolutely off his rocker, isn't he?
He's not a likable protagonist. And yeah, I don't like him, and I find him annoying.
But then there's not many people that you can like in this. And I mean, I suppose Evie is supposed to be the closest person that you're supposed to side with, because she is supposed to be like, we're experiencing the film through her eyes. She meets V, she goes on this journey. But even so, like Natalie Portman's British accent aside, she's like, she doesn't go through much. Like, I don't know if her development really works. I mean, she has that whole prison scene where she ends up looking like G.I. Jane, and like she goes through that, and then she kind of just accepts it, and she says she's like changed, but she's just been like on her sofa at home, not really doing anything from the sounds of it.
Yeah, you say she says she's changed. Does she literally say that I've changed? That's I think she might like have some sort of dialogue similar to that, where she's like, I've changed.
Wow. That's what intense torture will do to you.
It reminds me of that Futurama scene where the devil is really angry at Fry's opera, and he goes, you can't just have your characters say what they feel. That makes me feel angry. It's just like dreadful writing.
What was true in that cell is just as true now. What you felt in there has nothing to do with me.
I can't feel anything anymore.
You can't just have your characters announce how they feel. That makes me feel angry.
I mean, they tried, didn't they? There's a few moments where it's quite intense. I mean, V's final scene when he's surrounded by goons and he's getting shot at, and then he's like, if I'm still standing, I'm going to basically shiv you all up. And that I enjoyed that bit.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a good fight scene. What is it? Like, I'll kill you all before you reload or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And it is very rousing when, you know, all of those people, or those hundreds of people, you know, in Parliament Square. It's a great shot. I'm not sure how they did it. I don't think you can close down Parliament Square I assume it's green screen. It's a shame that mask has really taken on quite a legacy of its own, and some of it good, some of it not so good. You know, that I'm sure they couldn't have predicted that. But it speaks to the power of the scene, and that, like, even though I think this is an incredibly sloppy film, that the point that V makes about him being a symbol, the mask is a symbol, you can't destroy a symbol, that is it's a very powerful point. And that scene is a very powerful scene. And the legacy of that mask and the anonymous movement and all of that speaks to how powerful it is and how well done that is in the film.
Yeah, and I think when you compare V to Caesar in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, you've both got characters which are, like, in order to be a revolutionary in these two films, you have to almost succumb to the government, and sort of like you have to do evil things to try and make things right. But I don't know if that's the way to stop a dystopian society. Like, both of them, they're trying to use violence to try and overthrow the government, but both of them don't fully succeed in creating this sort of like they can't create utopias out of these worlds.
That's a really good point. I think more importantly, like, these men will not be able to create utopias out of these worlds because they are such a product of these dystopias. Like, the downfall of Caesar in the original cut, to become that violent, barbaric person that will fit in the original Planet of the Apes, and I mean, there's no downfall for V. He is insane at the start of the film, but, like, we see what caused his downfall earlier that's been brought upon him. Yeah, they're the right men to overthrow the dystopia, but yeah, there's no way they're going to build a utopia out of it. That needs to be handed on to Evie and the other people at the end of V for Vendetta, and well, it's just not going to happen in the Planet of the Apes because we've seen the future of that world.
Yeah, but they both become symbols, don't they? They're almost like martyrs almost. I mean, especially V, because he does die, but they become symbols of what they want the next society to be. Almost, they want them. So there needs to be some sort of like powerful uprising in order to get things back on track, but we don't see the other side of these things. We're just seeing sort of like the violence that is needed to shake things up, and obviously it's not getting to where it needs to get to change things. But I think what they're trying to instill in the next people which will take over from them is hope, isn't it? Because it's hope which drives the people to have these uprisings, hope for change, hope for something different. And it's just the methods that they're using don't seem to be working. I mean, in V for Vendetta, you've got people joining together in this sort of like sense of community around it. And I suppose you do have it in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes as well. It's bringing people together in order to sort of like hopefully reverse things and bring about change. And I think those are the kind of messages which will work in dystopian fiction and just in general. That's the kind of message you want. You want a message of hope, but sometimes like these uprisings and these revolutionaries that are being depicted, they're not showing hope from the offset. It's something which will come afterwards.
Yeah, we're a long way from hope, I think, in these dystopias.
Another bleak episode
Another
for you
bleak
listeners.
Another bleak ending, yes. But we can look forward to maybe having a little bit of fun next time on the show.
Yeah, I think next time's going to be quite fun. We are looking at Dangerous Games next week with Kevin Lyons, our second guest of the series. I'm very excited to talk to him on the show.
Yeah, we're returning to the Dangerous Games idea that we looked at in our VR series. And we're going to do a couple of episodes on Dangerous Games this series, but next week it's Dangerous Voluntary Games that you enter yourself into by your own volition. The films that we've got for that are Rollerball from 1975 and Death Race 2000, also from 1975. Two similar, violent, crazy films. I've not seen either. I'm really looking forward to watching both of them.
Yeah, and they are fun, guys. They're fun films. There's going to be some bleakness. I mean, we're doing the series on dystopia. You can't get around it. But I think there's going to be a lot of fun to be had as well, especially with Death Race 2000.
So join us and Kev for that. We're really looking forward to that. But in the meantime, if you want to reach out to us, you can send us an email, journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com, or find us on our Facebook discussion group, or you can find us on all of the social medias. We're all over those. You know what they are. You know how to find us. You type in the words in the search bar and then our account shows up.
That's the one. And of course, if you want to support the podcast, you can do so through our Patreon. And if you sign up, you can also get bonus episodes of the show. We've got plenty of content over there. So yeah, if you're feeling generous and you want some extra content, sign on up.
But if you can't afford that, or you just don't want to, that's absolutely fine. But if you still want to support the show, you can leave us a nice review. So leave us a 5-star review. And in your review, why don't you let me know why I should read Alan Moore's V for Vendetta, having said what I've said about the movie. Make a case for it and I will consider it.
That's it from us. We'll see you next time.